I hope you've enjoyed it. I've covered a lot. Um, and, like with all of these presentations, it's really just meant to be a beginning point and hopefully gives you a bit more to chew on if you're interested in going further. But thank you very much for listening. And yeah, we'll see you back here for the next presentation. Hello, my name is Patrick De Silva, and I'll be your host on our next episode of Let's Talk About Religion, sponsored by Pitkin County Senior Services. Today we're going to talk about Islam. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I think one of the first questions many people have about Islam actually refers or pertains to the one who's perceived as the founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, whose name literally means the praiseworthy one, born approximately 570 the Common Era in Arabia. He was orphaned at an early age and grew up um, earning his living as a merchant, successful merchant in the area around Mecca. Um, he is reputed to have taken to a cave called Hira that's nearby Mecca. Um, and the tradition is that during one of these meditation sessions, he received a visit from the angel Gabriel, in Arabic Jibril, but it's understood to be the same angel as the Gabriel you may be familiar with from other traditions, such as Judaism and Christianity. And this angel, Gabriel, said to Muhammad, Iqra, Iqra b'ism rabbaka, recite in the name of your Lord. And this is where we get the name of the principal Muslim scripture, sacred text, al-Quran, which means the recitation. So this tradition holds that the angel Gabriel recited or commanded Muhammad to recite this text, that then he, even though he was illiterate, he recited this text piecemeal over the following several decades. He begins to receive revelations when he's approximately 40, and so in roughly 610 CE, and then it proceeds for the rest of his life. The images I have collected here on the left, on the left, we have one. This is of the Prophet Muhammad. This is supposed to be the early Muslim community who were kicked out of Mecca by the people who were in charge, the Quraysh. They fled to Medina, what was at that time known as Yathrib, which was a city populated by both Jewish and Arab tribes. And this early Muslim community was invited to come in and establish themselves there. And then later on, through a series of military conflicts and treaties that were negotiated, the early Muslim community then reclaimed Mecca. And so this is one depiction of that. Over on the right, this is a depiction of the Prophet Muhammad receiving those revelations um, in or nearby the caves and near Mecca. And I love these manuscripts in part because we see stuff in the news about, oh, you're not supposed to depict the Prophet Muhammad. Well, that wasn't always the case, which is something I'll get to a little bit later. It's a little bit about Muhammad. Let's move on to talking about scripture. So, as I said, the key scripture in the case of Islam is the Quran. It's arranged by length. The first surah, the al-Fatiha, which I'll get into the next slide or so, is quite short. But after that, Surat al-Baqarah, which is Surah of the Cow, is the largest, and then they get smaller the rest of the way. So it's not organized in a linear format. So there's history within it, or what some people would call history, what some people would call mythology, as we've discussed in my slides on scripture in Judaism and Christianity. The difference between history and mythology is quite porous and depends, as one more popular sage once said, very much on a certain point of view. But we classify the surahs, so that's the name for chapter, in the Quran by where they were revealed. So the tradition holds that some surahs were revealed in Mecca and some were revealed in Medina. That's one way of differentiating between them, just in a general sense. Within these surahs, we have many of the same or very similar stories as what you find in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. So we read about Adam, about Noah, Job, Jesus. Um, Jesus is known as Isa bin Miriam, so Jesus, son of Mary. Mary has her own uh, surah named after her and figures very prominently in the Quran. Um, and this speaks to again how these three traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are really linked very, very intimately, and we see it really in the scripture. In the Muslim tradition, the classification that developed very early on for people who had a religious scripture, which is Ahad al-Kitab, or literally people of the book, and that meant for Jews it was the Torah, for Christians it was the Injil, or the Gospels, meaning the New Testament here. And this possession of a book, of a kitab, a scripture, conferred upon those communities a certain amount of legitimacy. Um, Now, the other main, I would say, corpus of scripture that is very, very important for Muslims is the hadith and the sunnah. So this is basically the multifaceted tradition, or really traditions, of the things that the Prophet Muhammad is reputed to have said and done. Now, the vocab here, I'll just point out here, the isnad is the part of a hadith tradition that tells you, literally it means the chain, meaning, if you think about this game that some of us perhaps played when we were children, a game of telephone, right? And so and so, it's, person one tells person two, tells person three, and you have this chain of transmission. And then the matan is the content of that message. And this is very, very important because similarly to in the case of Christianity, where the accounts of what Jesus said and did are very important, so too are they in the case of Islam. Even though theologically speaking, Islam is very clear that Jesus is a prophet, but he's not divine. That's a very clear delineation. That the Prophet Muhammad is also not divine. In fact, he's held to have only two miracles. The first is the Quran, and the second is the night journey where he ascends into heaven, the story of where he ascends into heaven, and sort of has his encounter, a more direct encounter with God. Okay, let's go on and get into the scripture a little bit more. So this, I just thought it would be nice to give you a very short, I mean, this is kind of the classic, Surat al-Fatiha, meaning the opening. That's what al-Fatiha means. So what I'll do is I'll just read the Arabic here, and I'll read it in English and then in Arabic, and you can kind of see how things sound. So we have Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the infinitely compassionate and merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Praise be to God, Lord of all the worlds, the compassionate, the merciful. Maliki Yawmiddin, ruler on the day of judgment. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. To you alone do we worship, and you alone do we ask for help. Ihdana sirat al-mustaqim, sirat al-ladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayri maghdubi alayhim, wala-dhalin. So guide us on the straight path. It's a phrase you'll hear a lot. Surat al-mustaqim. The path of those who have received your grace, not the path of those who have brought down wrath, nor of those who wander astray. And then, and then sometimes people would add in a phrase, Sadaqa Allahu al-Azim, which means, God is most righteous and upright. And this translation is actually by Kabir Helmininsky, so thank you to Kabir for that. Okay, if you want a really great book on the Quran, there's Approaching the Quran by Michael Sells, which I'll talk about a little bit later at the end of where we go over the resources. So that's just a little taste of the Quran, and the way it sounds is very, very important. This was the power of the Quran in its own time of revelation, was people compared it to the poetry of the day, and they felt that this was different. This was a different register of language. And so, theologically speaking, the claim here is that the Quran is, people would say, Kalamullah, or God's speech. So this is the theological claim that, God transmitted the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad through the angel Gabriel as the intermediary. And then the Prophet Muhammad recited it, literally, to the early Muslim community, and from there it spread. Okay, let's move on. We talk sometimes about denominations when we talk about religious traditions, and in the presentation on Judaism, I spoke about differentiating between Orthodox and Reform and Conservative, and certainly in the presentation on Christianity, we talked a lot about all these different denominations. The two main denominations we talk about in the case of Islam are the Sunni, also known as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or the people of tradition and community or society. Today, the Sunni represent approximately 90% of the Muslim population, and they are linked very clearly to Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr was sort of this elder statesperson, one of the Prophet Muhammad's earliest converts and confidants. I sort of compare him to, depending on your political persuasion, sort of the Dick Cheney or the Joe Biden figure, for President George W. Bush or Barack Obama, respectively, this elder statesperson. Now, he becomes the first caliph after the Prophet Muhammad dies, and the issue in 632 is that normally someone like the Prophet Muhammad dying, his son would take over, but he did not have any sons. So then the community had two options. There was sort of recognizing this elder statesperson of Abu Bakr as taking on leadership of the whole community, or there was also the idea that it could be kind of through marriage and / bloodline, and this is where the Shia come in. So the word Shia or Shi'i is sort of partisan or party. So the Shi'ats of Ali are the party of Ali, party in like the political sense, or the faction of Ali. So there was the Shi'at of Abu Bakr, and then we also have the Shi'at of Ali. Now, who is Ali? Ali was married to Fatima, who was the Prophet Muhammad's daughter. Now, today, the Shia constitute, as you can see here in the slide, approximately 10% of the world's Muslim population. But they retain this very deep investment in the power of the prophetic bloodline. Um, People always ask, oh, we read in the news about Sunni and Shia, fighting, and they compare it to, maybe Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, or, other types of religiously driven discord. Um, I think it's important to recognize that in the beginning, this is, I see it as a difference of opinion and how we're going to determine who is in charge. Now, over time, that gets, these identities they get driven in and they get reified, as we say. And a key event is actually in 680 CE in the city of Karbala, which is in present-day Iraq. Um, and in Karbala, what happens is Ali's son, um, Hussein, um, is killed along with a group. He's leading a faction against the ruling, well, what would later be known as Sunni organization or dynasty, the Umayyads. And the story is that you have this small band led by Hussein. They're surrounded and they're massacred. Now it's held up as this example of sort of Sunni, I guess, persecution of the Shia. And this piece in calligraphy I have here, which I think is very powerful, this saying is, um, okay, Kullu yawmu ashura wa kullu ardan Karbala, meaning every day is Ashura, which is the day or the period of days on which this massacre happened, and every place is Karbala. And this actually is held up from a social justice point of view today by Muslims, especially Shia, as there's this injustice, we've been persecuted, um, and it goes on. This actually was published. This phrase, the English translation, was featured in a commentary or an obituary after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, um, and as a statement of, hey, injustice exists, and we need to deal with it. Now, another group that we talk about quite a bit in terms of, I guess, denominations in Islam are the Sufis. So Sufism, which I'll have a whole different presentation on Sufism um, later, is basically the mystics of Islam, is how we would describe them. And now, people historically could be Sunni or Shi'i. You kind of were either one or the other, speaking very generally. But then you could be Sufi and Sunni. You could be Sufi and Shi'i. Sufism was more of a way, an affect, we would say, a way of engaging more directly with the divine. And in the separate slideshow I do on that, I'll go into way more detail on that. In the modern period, we see more of people who would claim, oh, I'm Sufi and I'm not even Muslim. I'll also get into that later on. That's more of a kind of North American, Western European phenomenon. All right, so along with denominations, we get into demographics. Um, when I teach courses on Islam, I always ask my students, well, where do you think the most populated Muslim communities are? And they'll say, Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Morocco. Or one time a student said France. But in truth, we're looking mostly at, if we have 1.7 billion, Muslims, roughly, that the vast majority of those are in South and Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Malaysia, I have here Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. Only, as it says, only 20% of Muslims in the world are Arab. So we have this tradition that, especially here in the US, we tend to think of as being inherently Arab, but that only covers a small minority of all the people in the world who identify as being Muslim. And I think that's important to just kind of reflect on, like, why is it that we have those ideas? So part of it is because there are these rituals that are part of the tradition that are very much still grounded um, in many cases, Saudi Arabia, because Mecca and Medina are there. So this image is of the Kaaba. Here we go. So this is the Kaaba, so this black cube here, which is sort of, we could say, the axis mundi in many respects for many, many, many Muslims. When you engage in salat, the ritual prayer that happens that you would do 5 times a day, you the main thing you need to do is face towards Mecca, face towards the Kaaba. Um, if you go to a hotel in Morocco or in Indonesia, um, which are both Muslim majority countries, a lot of times you'll see a little arrow in your hotel room that will just is meant to help people figure out, oh, like what direction am I facing? Oh, I'm facing, if I'm in Morocco, I need to face east. If I'm in Indonesia, I need to face west, to help people orient themselves. Now, this picture is from the Hajj, which is another one of these so-called 5 pillars. So the Hajj, which actually dates back to before Islam, where Mecca was this huge trading hub, and so people would come to Mecca on a regular basis. And of course, before Islam, it was, uh, you know, a polytheist religious environment, and that was one of the big changes that Muhammad and the early Muslims brought about, was a very clearly asserted claim of monotheism. I mean, that's what Allah means, is the deity, the God. And so, today, as I record this in July of 2020, um, you know, the authorities in Saudi Arabia have announced that they're going to severely curtail the number of people who are permitted to come to Saudi Arabia, to come to Mecca for the Hajj, out of concerns of spreading the coronavirus. But normally, a normal Hajj, you have millions of people from all over the world. It's upheld as an obligation that each Muslim is supposed to sincerely want to fulfill. Of course, it's recognized that not all are able to do so. Um, Now, if we go back to the beginning, usually we talk about Shahada, or the profession of faith, which is stating there is no God, as I say, with a little g, except Allah, which is God with a big G, and Muhammad is his um, messenger. All right. So stating that sincerely before an assembly of other Muslims is kind of the official way that many Muslims who convert, that they do so. We spoke briefly about ritual prayer, salat, which I'll also expand on a bit later. We have almsgiving, or zakat, which is usually roughly 2.5% of one's um, income, which is then donated to the local mosque, donated to charity. And then fasting during Ramadan, or Saum. This is a fast that kind of once you hit puberty or recognized as an adult, virtually speaking, then you're expected to fast from dawn until dusk. And of course, there are lots of exceptions for people who are elderly, people who are sick, if you're pregnant, all kinds of things. But this is, something that a lot of people who aren't Muslim, or maybe not familiar with Islam, have perhaps heard of. And we see fasting in particular as a ritual found in many, many different traditions. Christians, some denominations have Lent. There's different fasting traditions in Judaism, certainly in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so forth. So let's focus on salat. Now, I had to use this image because it's just adorable. This little kid who's mimicking his parents. Um, and so salat here, both these images are shown at a masjid, or a mosque, where everyone lines up. Now, usually men line up in one area and women line up in, not all, but in many mosques, women lined up either behind the men, or sometimes they're in a different room. And I'll talk about sort of debates on those practices a little bit later. Um, there's a person who is the imam who is leading the prayer. They stand towards the mihrab, which marks um, the direction towards Mecca. So when you go into a mosque, you'll be able to find the mihrab, and that's like a little niche or niche in the wall that's usually very decorated. That is marking the direction towards Mecca. Part of the mosque service, um, especially the Friday or Jummah noon or midday prayer, is the khutbah, which is the address, or you could think of it as a sermon, usually given by the imam. Before Muslims pray, uh, you um, you clean yourself, so wudu, which involves cleaning, your hands and your feet and your face. And then what you see people doing here, where they're prostrating themselves, is known as sajda. So these are all, you may have seen images of Muslims praying, and it's quite um, powerful in these. Anytime you have a large group of people and they're acting in unison, there's an energy there of a great power, I think. So to see in some cases, if you're at a very large mosque, um, like in Delhi at the Jama Masjid, you have thousands of people who are standing, kneeling all the way down, um, as part of this ritual prayer. Now, it doesn't have to happen at the mosque in terms of a building. One of the things that's quite striking, if you travel, if you have traveled, or if you travel in the future to countries where you hear the call to prayer, the adhan, um, is that you'll see people who will pray in very kind of day-to-day spaces. So when I was much younger, I was studying in Cairo, and I remember being in the computer lab, and we heard the call to prayer. And my classmates who were Muslim just paused what they were doing in the computer lab and got up and went to the corner of the room, figured out the Qibla, or the direction towards Mecca, and then they prayed. And, it takes a few minutes, and then they went back to what they were doing. And it can seem to be a very different attitude towards prayer. I think in the U.S. especially, we have this idea of religion as it goes into these buildings, and we go into those buildings on Saturdays, Fridays, Sundays, whenever, and we just do the religion there. And in other cultures, other religious traditions, you have different ideas and conceptions about where religion happens. And I think salat is one really great example of that. Okay, we'll move on. So, as we talk about these different conceptions about religion, I did want to talk about challenges that Muslims face today, and I'm especially thinking about in the U.S. We talk about Islamophobia. Now, in the presentation on Judaism, I talked about anti-Semitism, which is sadly, has been on the rise in recent years. Well, the discrimination that Muslims face here in the U.S., talk more pointedly because that's our context, it is quite painful for this community. Now, it's not just recently. I mean, this is kind of an older cartoon with Bugs Bunny facing some type of, stereotypical Middle Easterner, with the scimitar and the turban and the beard. Wonderful analysis of these types of depictions in mass media is by Jack Shaheen, Real Bad Arabs, where real is spelled R-E-E-L. He talks about this history of just the stereotypical depiction of Muslims and the conflating of the categories of Arab and Muslim when, demographically speaking, that's a small minority of the world Muslim population, and also there are Arabs who are Christian on top of that. So that's one aspect of Islamophobia. We have seen what I would call anti-Muslim laws that have been passed in recent years. So this is a billboard from North Carolina, where actually I used to live. And this is in response to President Trump's administration passing these immigration bans that really did focus on a series of Muslim majority countries. And there's this rhetoric of, as you see here, well, 19 Muslims were responsible for the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. You also see laws that are aimed at forbidding the imposition of Sharia or Islamic law here in the U.S. There are laws that municipalities ban, forbidding Muslim communities from broadcasting the call to prayer, from even having a mosque, period. All kinds of things that are different levels of racism and discrimination that Muslims experience here in the U.S. and frankly in many other places. Even this graffiti here, this slide, this image I found online, is from Australia, and you can find similar types of incidents of anti-Muslim acts of graffiti and people having their shops broken into and so forth. So this is a real challenge that Muslims face today, and I think it's part of highlighting the experience of people today is talking about these types of challenges. So I mentioned before the debates, or another kind of set of a debate that we have going on right now in the Muslim community is talking about access to, or equal access to, participation at the mosque. So in the presentation on Judaism, I mentioned how in some Jewish traditions, men and women pray separately. In Christianity, we have different denominational positions on women serving as ministers or priests or in leadership capacities. And so similarly, in the case of Islam and Muslim communities today, we have these debates going on about whether men and women should mix and sit and stand and so forth, mostly standing and kneeling side by side at the mosque. And this is a picture of American Muslim scholar Amina Wadud, who actually led a Jummah, or a Friday prayer. This was, her assertion of, based on her, she's a scholar, based on her studying the Quran and the Muslim tradition, that she really saw there was no reason that a woman could not lead the prayer. And, this is definitely not the convention in most places, but we have these examples of mosques that are explicitly welcome to having women lead the prayer, to having men and women pray, side by side. And I think, I just want to highlight that this is a through line when we look at religious traditions today, 20th going into the 21st century, that debates over gender are very consistent. we find debates over gender on a consistent basis. The specifics of it, the details of it, certainly shift from context to context. But this is definitely a big one today within the Muslim community. So, okay, well, that was a very fast run through the broad brushstrokes of an introduction to Islam. Obviously, we could do a whole year's worth of seminars on any one of those slides and get into real detail. But here are some resources that I like to recommend if you wanted to read or listen or watch a bit more. So Keisha Ali's Lives of Muhammad, Carl Ernst's Following Muhammad are both great sort of, I'd call them like textbooks, both focused on Muhammad, and then Following Muhammad by Carl Ernst is actually more of an Intro to Islam textbook. Christian Gruber's more recent book, The Praiseworthy One, again, that's Prophet Muhammad, is about the visual depiction and debates over the visual depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. Um, a wonderful novel set in alternating between Indiana and Syria is Mojakov's The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf, a wonderful story. I mean, it's a fictional, it's a novel about a woman's experience sort of growing up as a Muslim in Indiana and teasing out all the challenges of being Muslim and American. I mentioned Amina Wadud. This is just Quran and Woman is her major book. Um, I would also recommend, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think it's a foundational text uh, for kind of mid 20th century America. And I think in Malcolm X's conversion story and how he talks about the meaning of Islam for him, the experience he has when he goes on the Hajj to Mecca, where he's uprooted from a segregated society in the US in the 1960s, and all of a sudden he's eating and drinking, every day with his fellow Muslim pilgrims from all over the world. Um, there's also the famous movie by Spike Lee, of course, but I would recommend reading the book. I always think the book is better than the movie myself. Um, Aja Media Collective is a wonderful website which has a bunch of stuff, articles, podcasts, that really take you beyond the idea of Islam being rooted in the Arab world and the Arabic-speaking world. And I think it's a wonderful resource. A lovely documentary, Quran by Heart. You can see the whole thing, I think, for free on YouTube. But there's a Quran recitation contest every year in Cairo, and this documentary follows these three kids who are from, I believe it's Senegal, and then the Maldives, and then Tajikistan, which, if you'll note, are each of these three children then don't speak Arabic as their native language, but they have memorized the Quran in Arabic. I should have mentioned earlier, salat, the ritual prayers are always done in Arabic. The Quran, ritually speaking, is always in Arabic. I mean, obviously people have translated it many times over into all the relevant languages. Quranic recitation holds a very special place in Muslim devotional life, and this is this link to the Maidan, which is another wonderful website. Maidan meaning like the public square. You heard of Maidan Tahrir from Cairo during the Arab Spring, and same Maidan. But Haja Maria Ulfa, who is a woman from Indonesia, is a master Quran reciter, and this is an interview or a presentation that she gave. And then lastly, I found an interview with Muhammad Zakaria, who is an American convert to Islam, originally from, I think, Ventura, California. And he converted a number of decades ago and found his way into calligraphy and studied calligraphy extensively in Turkey. And during the last Bush administration, he actually produced this stamp. This is so calligraphy for Eid Mubarak, which is sort of like Arabic for happy holidays, and for major Muslim holidays you would say Eid Mubarak. And so this is a stamp that you can get at the post office, and it's an interview where he talks about his process and what calligraphy means to him. So that's what I have for today. I hope I've whet your appetite to learn quite a bit more. I'm sure you'll have questions, and these resources will help point you in the direction of not just answers, but even more importantly, more questions. And that wraps us up for today's session on talking about Islam. Stay tuned for our future sessions talking about Sufism and more, we hope. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for listening.